Every other episode in this series has been about science, physics, biology, cosmology. Today we're doing something different. Today we're doing history. Because the resurrection of Jesus isn't just a theological claim floating free of evidence. It's a claim about something that supposedly happened at a specific point in time, in a specific place, witnessed by specific people. And that means it's open to the same kind of historical investigation scholars applied to any other ancient event. Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Alexander's conquests, the assassination of Julius Caesar himself. So today we're going to use a method historians actually developed for exactly this kind of question. It's called the minimal facts approach. And it does something unusual. Instead of starting with the whole Bible and asking you to accept it as inspired scripture, it starts with a small set of historical facts about Jesus' death and his disciples' experiences afterward. Facts so well evidenced that the overwhelming majority of scholars in the field accept them, including openly skeptical, agnostic, and atheist historians who reject the resurrection itself. Then we ask a simple question: what's the best explanation for those facts? The minimal facts approach was developed and popularized by scholars like Gary Habermas, who did something methodologically clever. He surveyed literally thousands of academic publications on the resurrection, written across a wide spectrum of theological and philosophical positions: liberal, conservative, atheist, Jewish, agnostic, and identified which specific facts were considered so well supported by the evidence that they were accepted across that entire spectrum, regardless of the scholar's own conclusions about what actually happened. This is an important distinction to sit with. We're not talking about facts only conservative Christian scholars accept. We're talking about facts that show up as common ground, even in the work of scholars who go on to argue the resurrection didn't happen and who propose alternative, naturalistic explanations instead. That's a much higher bar than simply citing scholars who already agree with the conclusion. So let's walk through the core facts themselves, usually somewhere between 4 and 6, depending on how a particular scholar organizes them, and look at why each one is so widely accepted. This might seem obvious, but it's worth establishing carefully because it rules out some popular alternative theories right from the start. The crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate is attested not just in the Gospels, but in non-Christian sources as well. The Jewish historian Josephus references it, and the Roman historian Tacitus, writing with clear hostility toward Christianity, confirmed that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate. Medical scholars who have studied the physiological effects of Roman crucifixion, the blood loss, the asphyxiation process, the practice of confirming death with a spear wound, as described in John's Gospel, have concluded that the idea Jesus merely swooned and later revived, sometimes called the swoon theory, is essentially untenable, given what we know about the brutal mechanics of the practice. This fact is considered about as historically certain as anything from the ancient world gets, and it's accepted even by scholars who are firmly skeptical of the resurrection itself. Here's where things get genuinely interesting. Historically, it's not just that later Christian tradition claimed the disciples saw the risen Jesus. The evidence for this belief traces back remarkably early, to a source most scholars, including skeptical ones, date to within just a few years of Jesus' death. In 2 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul records what appears to be an early creed, a short, structured summary of core Christian belief that scholars widely agree Paul didn't compose himself, but received from earlier Christian tradition and passed along, likely within just a few years of the crucifixion. That creed states plainly that Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and appeared to Peter, then to the 12 disciples, then to a group of more than 500 people at once, many of whom, Paul notes, were still alive at the time of his writing. and could be asked directly. The significance of this dating is hard to overstate. This isn't a legend that slowly grew over decades or centuries. The way skeptics sometimes assume ancient religious claims develop. This is a formalized belief about resurrection appearances, circulating and already crystallized into a repeatable creed within a time frame far too short for the kind of gradual legendary development that critics typically propose for other ancient miracle claims. Whatever ultimately happened, the disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Jesus is not a late invention. It's about as early and well attested as anything in ancient history gets. Here's a fact that even the most skeptical historians find genuinely hard to explain away. A man who was actively persecuting the early Christian movement, by his own account, dramatically reversed course and became one of Christianity's most committed and effective advocates, at real personal cost. Paul, formerly known as Saul, wasn't a sympathetic outsider who slowly warmed to Christian ideas. He describes himself in his own letters as someone who violently opposed the church and who then experienced something he understood as an encounter with the risen Jesus, an experience that completely reoriented the trajectory of his life. He went on to endure beatings, imprisonment, shipwrecks, and eventually, according to early Christian tradition, execution in Rome, all in service of a claim he had every social and personal incentive to reject. Skeptical historians don't have to accept that Paul actually saw the risen Jesus to acknowledge the historical fact underneath it. Paul sincerely believed he had experienced something that changed his mind at enormous personal cost, in a way that's difficult to explain through ordinary motives like social advancement or personal gain, since his conversion cost him status, safety, and eventually his life. This last fact tends to be less well known, but it's one scholars find particularly hard to explain away. According to the Gospels themselves, Jesus' own brother James was, during Jesus' lifetime, skeptical of him. The Gospel of Mark records the family, including his brothers, at one point believing Jesus was out of his mind. That's not a detail early Christians would have invented about the family of their own leader unless it were true, since it reflects poorly on Jesus' own household. And yet, within a remarkably short time after the crucifixion, we find this same James leading the Jerusalem church, mentioned by Paul as one of the resurrection witnesses, and eventually, according to the first-century historian Josephus, a non-Christian source, being executed for his faith in Jesus as the Messiah. What changed a skeptical sibling into a leader willing to die for his brother's cause? Something happened between his own family thought he was out of his mind, and his brother is leading the movement built around him and will die for it. Historians across the spectrum consider this a genuine puzzle that any complete explanation of early Christianity has to account for. So here's where the minimal facts approach does its real work. We have a set of facts accepted across a wide scholarly spectrum. Jesus really died by crucifixion. His disciples, within just a few years, were already proclaiming a formalized belief that he appeared to them individually and in groups. A hostile persecutor abruptly converted at enormous personal cost, and a skeptical family member did the same. Scholars who reject the resurrection have proposed alternative explanations over the years, that the disciples experienced hallucinations, that the appearances were visionary rather than physical, that the story grew through legendary embellishment over time. Each of these theories has to work hard to explain the full set of facts together, not just one at a time. Group hallucinations are not well documented in psychology the way individual ones are. A purely visionary explanation struggles to account for the empty tomb tradition and the disciples' insistence on bodily language. And the legendary development theory runs straight into the extremely early dating of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, which leaves little time for that kind of gradual growth. None of this constitutes mathematical proof. History rarely works that way for any ancient event. But the resurrection hypothesis, unlike its rivals, explains all of these well-established facts together, without requiring multiple separate, independently unlikely explanations stacked on top of each other. That's exactly the kind of reasoning historians use to evaluate competing explanations for any ancient event, which theory accounts for the full body of evidence with the fewest strained assumptions. We didn't start today by asking you to accept the Bible as inspired scripture. We started with a small set of historical facts that skeptical scholars themselves accept and asked what best explains them. The resurrection isn't a claim floating free of evidence, resting on faith alone with nothing underneath it. It's a historical claim, built on some of the earliest, best-attested facts we have from the ancient world, and for 2,000 years, it's remained the explanation that accounts for all of them, together, without asking you to believe 5 separate coincidences instead of one consistent story. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.